right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking some time out of your very busy schedules and joining me today for today's Lunch and Learn served to you by Cross IT, or as I like to call them, Todd Talks. So thanks for joining us. Now, what we're going to be looking at today is the let function. We had talked about it in our last time together, the let notation as one of the methods of passing parameters back and forth, and that got me thinking we might have glossed over some things specific to the let function. So let's go ahead, circle back, and we'll take a look at that in a little bit more in depth. So with that, let's go ahead and let's start talking about what does the let function allow me to do. Now what you see here is that the first thing it does is that it allows you to assign results of an expression to a variable within the calculation that you're defining, which is very helpful. And then because you have those results declared in those local variables, then you can return a result using any combination of those variables then. It can also make your complex formulas easier to read because it reduces the number of times you have to call a function within a function. I think we've all seen that. We've all been there. It certainly can be troublesome. It also makes your formulas more efficient. The reason why it does that is because you're storing the results of the calculation. It reduces the number of function calls you have to make within that calculation, so you're not making all these redundant function calls. So you do gain a little bit of efficiency as well. We're going to hit some of the examples in depth here, but if you want to get more information, you can always jump out to the Claris help page. You can see it's pretty extensive on the information that you can find out about let. Now the one thing just to let you know is that let is actually classified as a logical function, so that's where you're going to find it here, along with the case statement, choose, if, some of the is valid, those kinds of things. It seems like it might be a little bit out of place. But that's just with let, it's very hard to define what it does because you can do so many things with it. That's why we wanted to spend some time here today talking about it so that if you're not using it, you can become comfortable enough to begin using it. As you saw there in the help, let has actually been around since FileMaker 7. Now I started using the platform with FileMaker 6. So it was there when version 7 came out, but it was probably version I think 8.5, maybe even FileMaker 9 before I felt comfortable enough to begin using it because I attended a training class and we'd covered it there where I'd just kind of seen it in the help. I had trouble wrapping my head around it. So I certainly understand if you've been intimidated by that particular function. So let's go ahead and look at the syntax of the function. When you first start working it in the calculation editor, and this is in any place where you can define a calculation and you start the type ahead, this is what it's going to fill in there. You see on the top line where it's let, the var expression with some curly braces and brackets and a calculation. Okay. That's all well and good, but again, still kind of hard to read to figure out, okay, what do I need to plug in where? So you are able to take the let function, separate things out on different lines, and so I like using what I call the Wellerized version, which you see there at the bottom, where you can see the components, where we've got the let statement, the brackets, some lines of where we're declaring our variables, and then finally we get to the result and the final calculation there. All right, so let's go ahead and dig into that just a little bit more. As I said, in between that set of square brackets is where you're going to declare a variable and set it equal to an expression. So what are those variable types? Well, it can be a function variable or a local variable which only exists while that calculation is being evaluated. I know some developers, and it's a bit of a standard depending on where you're at, they will use like a tilde character in front of the variable name so that you know that, okay, this is a local variable. I personally don't do that because my naming convention is that field names and script and global variables all have the upper camel case, so I'm okay just using the regular camel case. When I see it, I know, okay, this is a variable that I declared in my let function earlier. Okay, All right, so you got the local variables. You also got your script variables, or which are those $ variables. You can declare them inside a let function. It is this functionality that allows the let notation that we looked at when passing parameters. That's what allowed it to work the way that it does, is because you can declare these script variables. You've also got global variables, of course, which are the double $ variables. And then the expression types, they can be, a calculation that includes, any number of functions. You can also set the variables equal to field values, based on the context of how the calculation is being evaluated. And of course, you can set them equal to constants. All right, so then down below there, you see that is the calculation, which again is some combination of functions, probably going to be a combination of the variables that you declared above. You can include additional field values there if you want, any number of constants, whatever is going to get you the final result that you need from this calculation. All right, now there's an optional thing, which is in the square brackets. If you're only declaring a single variable, you do not need, obviously the square brackets and then the semicolon separator there. However, I like using it just because everything is then consistent. Whether I have one variable or 10 variables, I'm going to see, the opening square bracket, the closing square bracket. If I need to, add additional variables because, the calculation needs to be updated, the brackets are already there. I just put in my semicolon and then add my second line. So like I said, is it optional? I don't think so, but that's, that helps me sleep better at night if it is. All right, if it's in there. All right, very good. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and let's just start using it. Okay, now what we're looking at here, this is, a database of just some generic contacts that I needed for a demo, not unlike this one. So it's just a random combination of first and last names that have been put together. So, the people aren't real. But to make it seem more real, I wanted to make sure that I had an email address. And of course, I didn't want to set, because it's going to be all different people. You don't want to use the same email address format every single time. So I wanted to come up with some kind of calculation that would adjust the, the short name, at the beginning of the email, and the domain based on, a couple different options. So we have, first initial, last name, first name only, first name with last initial, full name. So there's about 5 or 6 combinations there that I was working with, and then I just selected, I think, the top 10 or 12 email providers to select the domain. All right, so just going to go ahead and just dive in here and select a random person. And if I go up to my scripts menu and then I go ahead and generate the email address, I'm just doing it here in a custom dialog so that we're able to see it. And you can see it gave me the first name, last name, and it selected how it's going to display that email. So what does that calculation look like? Well, let's get into our script editor here and then dive into that script. Let me bring it front and center here. And so here's the email address that I'm declaring, and that looks pretty ugly, right? You can see there's a lot of stuff here that's repeated because I'm filtering to make sure that I only have the allowed characters for the emails. You see there's multiple uses here where I've got first name and last name that are being pulled in. And okay, you could probably understand it now right after you've written it, but if you need to come back in and change something in 6 months or a year, how long is it going to take you to figure out exactly what's going on? And that's where let allows you to break this down, make it a little bit more readable. And so that brings us to this second calculation here. And so now things, okay, now this I can understand. All right, and so what you have here is, again, we're just declaring variables to an expression. Now this first one here, so I don't have to keep repeating what I'm filtering. I can just go ahead and declare the filter text to a constant string of all the characters that are allowed. Now here I'm grabbing the first name and the last name for the individual. You'll notice I am going ahead and nesting a couple different functions, but it's still readable. Where I'm just grabbing the first name, changing it to lowercase, and then applying the filter to make sure I'm not getting any commas or things that could potentially have a bad email address. Okay, same thing for last name. Here's a statement again where I'm taking that first name and getting the first initial in case I need that. And then down here I'm generating a random number between 0 and 4, and then using that in this choose statement to select what format that short name portion of the email address is going to be. And you can see because of how things have been named, I'm able to figure out, okay, if it's 0, it's going to be first initial, last name. If it's a 1, it's the first name and the last initial, and so on and so forth. All right, again, we have another random number down here, and then that's what selects the domain with this choose statement. And then I come down here, and then my final calculation is just give me the name that you picked, put in the @ symbol, and then give me the domain, and then that's the final result. So if we go ahead and click OK on that, we'll get rid of that, come back here, and if I go ahead and run that, you'll see I get the same type of output, but again, that function is much more readable, easier to understand if I have to come back in and make changes later on. All right, one of the other cool things that the let function allows you to do is when you're debugging, and let me show you this. I'm going to go ahead and get back in to my script editor, and I'm just going to drop in here. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this all out. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open up my data viewer, which is found under the tools menu. If you don't have a tools menu, you actually do. It's just a feature that needs to be turned on. So if you're on a Mac, you can come over here under your FileMaker Pro menu, select Preferences, and then you would just select Use the Advanced Tools, and then restart FileMaker, and then you will have that menu available. If you're on Windows, the Preferences under the Edit menu, but same kind of thing. Just turn it on, and then you'll have it. And so in addition to the script debugger under Tools, you have the data viewer. And typically, you're using the current tab as you're stepping through your script so you can see what values are being loaded and changed and things like that. But you also have this watch where you can actually declare an expression that kind of just stays there all the time. And it's a great sandbox. So if you're working on a difficult or in-depth calculation and you just want to see what's going to happen before you add it to the field or the button or the script or wherever you're going to be placing it, you can work with it here. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new expression, and I'm just going to go ahead and paste in that calculation. I'm just going to go ahead and uncheck this box, and I'm going to tell it when I want to evaluate. But what's nice about let is based on how you name things, your script can be, or your function calculation can kind of be self-commenting, if you will. All right. Obviously, you can set variables to A, B, C, D, etc. But is it going to mean anything in the 6 months when you have to come back and tweak it a little bit? All right. So if you shorten the names but make them something that you can understand, you can realize, okay, this is my filter text. This is the first name, L name, obviously last name, and so forth. Okay. But if you need more than that, you can include comments, just like you would any other calculation, where the // comments the result out. Okay. And so that's what I'll like to do is if I'm having trouble where a calculation isn't quite evaluating the way I think it is that I'll just go ahead and comment out my final result, and then I can just put in an extra line here and say, okay, I want to check and make sure that my filter text is getting set to the right value. So I can just drop that in, click evaluate, and then check for my result down here and see, okay, so that part is working right. Well, what about first name? So if I just change that, click evaluate and say, okay, it is definitely pulling over the person's correct first name. All right. If I want to see, okay, is the random number really random? So I can just throw that in there. If I click, evaluate a few times, you can see that the value is changing as it, selects, that random number. So it's a nice way to kind of check as you're building a calculation and you're not getting the final result. You can kind of get back in there and see, okay, where exactly have things, broken down, if you will. So very helpful, technique that I use, quite often, when I get stuck like that. All right. And then if you hit monitor, then it just goes ahead and throws it over here, and then you'll have it for the next time you want to get into the data viewer. All right, so got a few more examples here. So let's go ahead. We're going to switch to a different found set, or a different found set of records, different thing. This is just a a series of orders, and you got the ship to, the bill to, all kinds of information. And so one of the things that, like I said, we mentioned before, is that the let function allows you to declare both script and global variables. Typically, I don't do that very often because I like the set variable step, just because it takes a few less clicks to get in there and see, okay, exactly what is this being declared to. But it certainly has its place and use. Like I said, the let function, or the let notation that we're using for parameters, is great. I love it. The other area is that what if I wanted to have something in a dynamic dialog box. All right, so if I come over here and I want to get the item details on this particular order, it tells me I can click to view my minimum, I can click to view my maximum, or I can just cancel. All right, now if I find an order that has, let me see, went the wrong direction. Okay, there's one. If I have an order that only has one item, but if I go up and run that same script, the cancel button is still there. The wording in here is a little different, and I only have the one button to go ahead and view the details. All right, so how did we do that? All right, so let's get back into our script editor here, and we can take a look at that. And what we're doing is, like I said, you don't have to, there's anywhere you can declare a calculation, you can use the let function. And so that's what I'm doing here. So we've got a show custom dialog that opens as soon as you run the script to ask you. Okay, but you'll see here I've got my title is piece of static text, but the message itself is using the let function. So let's get into that to where we can see that a little bit easier. And this is where we're just kind of building things out, where we're getting the item count. And like I said, and this is where using let in this way is very helpful. If you use the anchor buoy method, and depending on your naming convention, your table names can get very long for those tables that are 2, 3, 4 hops away from your base table. So instead of having all of that string repeated multiple times throughout your calculation, you can just go ahead and grab it, throw it into a variable here, and that's what I'm doing. But doing a little bit more, I'm getting the list, doing a value count so I can get my item count. All right, now this here is where I'm going ahead and declaring a script variable, or that single $sign variable here, based on that item count, that if it's greater than 2, it's minimum. If it's less than 2, it's blank. Same thing with button 2. If it's greater than, it says it's the maximum. If it's 1, it's view. And then we're doing a couple calculations here to get some text, again based on that item count, to make it dynamic. And then my final calculation is that if I've got more than 2 items, or 2 or more items, it includes text 1 as part of the string. If not, it just starts with that, throws in the button name that's dynamic, so I know whether it's view or maximum depending on the item count, and then it inserts whether it's the highest priced item or if it's just the item, okay, right here. All right. Now the other thing that helps me do is, like I said, that is the the body of that custom dialog. But because I used the $sign variables for the button names, I don't have to go down here and actually recalculate what button number 2 should be called or what button number 3 should be called. I can just put in the name of that script variable that was declared in the message and then use it here. Not that it's hard to have that calculation in both places, but if business rules change or you need to tweak that calculation, now you've got to remember to go ahead and change it in both spots. All right, so that's how we do that. All right, so go ahead and save it, even though I don't think I made any changes. Jump back over here. So if I run that script, it says view, and if I go back here to the one that has multiple items, run that same script, that's where I get now the minimum and the maximum, because my item count is greater than 2. All right. Now, one interesting thing that if you do use this technique is that the order matters. Like I said, we're calculating the values of button 2 and button 3, But if I go ahead and grab button 2 and said, I'd really like to see that value in my title as well. I mean, this isn't a great example because you wouldn't really want to see the button name, but there might be something that you have to calculate that you want to see in your title. So if I put that up here as well, okay, and click OK, save it. Let's get back to our data entry view layout, and I run that script. You'll see that even though it calculated button 2 as the name maximum, it's there, it's right here, but it's not up in the title where I told it to be. Well, like I said, the order matters. Okay, so if you actually want to have that to happen, you would actually need to do your calculation and declare your script variable in the title, and then it just kind of flows down from there. All right, so just a little bit of information there to remember. So let me put that back to the way it was. All right, and so we're good. All right. Now, another area where I like to use the let function, primarily just because it helps increase, for me, readability and understandability, is we're going to go ahead and run that same script. And like I said, we have, the options for minimum or maximum, which just pulls up and tells me what item was the highest priced item with the price. Okay. Well, there is another function in FileMaker that is very helpful when used in the proper places, and that is the execute SQL function, which allows you to run an SQL select statement outside of the context of the layout or the table that you're working in. So if you need to just quickly get a value, you can use this execute SQL, do a select, and pull that information over. And so that's what I'm doing here. But you will see that with the let statement, it just makes things a little bit more readable. All right, because the actual execute SQL statement you can see is right here. And what that is there's a query that you define, there's a separator for the values, and then there's a separator for the row, and then there's any parameters that you need to pass it to do the actual select statement. Now, my query is right here, which I've defined as a variable, which I could jam all of that right into here, but then I have one big long string. I don't know where it's going to wrap, so that might be confusing because of the way I write my select statements to make sure that I'm not going to be affected by any characters that the execute SQL doesn't like. I put in escapes and put in all my field names in quotes so that everything's going to work. So there's a lot going on there, but because I'm using the let statement, separating everything out and using the white space, you can see I'm selecting these two values from this table. I'm also joining it to this other table on product ID equaling product ID, where my packing slip ID is a certain value, and then I'm sorting it the price ascending. Okay, and then the rest is getting the list of all the items. The last one is I want to get the first one because this is for the maximum calculation, and then I just substitute out to get rid of that return statement. So I now have two values where the price is on the top line, description is the second line. Then I do a little bit of formatting, get my item price, get my item name, and then my calculation is just the statement that we see in that custom dialog box. So again, not a whole lot that you couldn't do altogether. Like I said, I just like it because of the improvements in readability because of that. And then of course we're handling things the same way as we get down to the highest priced item, and so on and so forth as we go through. Okay. So that's a couple areas. Now the other area, and again this is primarily for readability, is when I'm setting up my parameter to go to a script. And this is where I use, like I said, my preferred method is to set up items in a JSON object, which we looked at last time, and then it can just declare the variables for me. And as I pointed out, you can use let anywhere you can declare a function. So what I've done, I've got a script attached to these two buttons down here, where the one for the box, if I go ahead and just drill into that, you can see I'm setting the order ID name is, and the value pair is the order ID. And then the format is I want a packing slip. Okay, and again, because of the let function, I'm able to just kind of set things out, and then with the set element, because I'm using the brackets, I can declare multiple things at once. Where this is my JSON object, these are my two value pairs, and then just to help with readability when I'm troubleshooting, my actual calculation is just a format elements so that I get a nice readable text string whenever I go to look at it in my data viewer if I have to troubleshoot that. Okay, doing the same thing over here on the print button, except on this one I say, the order ID is the same, but this time I want an invoice. Okay. So go back into browse mode here now. And so if I go ahead and select the one with the package, you see I've got this packing slip that comes up, which giving me the weight so I know not to overload the truck as I'm getting it ready for shipment. Okay, put that over here. Now if I come back here, run that button, you'll see that, okay, now I'm getting the invoice, which now has the pricing information. Okay, so what exactly does that look like? I'm going to go ahead up here. I'm going to go ahead and enable the script debugger. Bring it over here. We're going to go ahead and turn on the data viewer so you can see what's happening there. Now this time I'm going to switch it over to the current tab. Obviously there's no script running, no global variables have been set, so everything is blank at this point. So we'll just go ahead and select the invoice. And now we can go ahead and step through the script debugger and you can see where it's telling me it's going to run that script. There's what it's going to set as the parameter based on our let calculation. Okay, and now we've got our order here. It runs it, and now you can see that it extracted two values from that, and here's our order ID, here's our format ID. And then we can just go through and continue. We're going to create a new window, enter find mode, find everything that's on that order, capture the error. If there is no error and we're using the invoice, we're going to go to the right layout. Going to update the title of the window, enter preview mode, adjust it to fit, and we're done. All right, so very helpful method for setting up those parameters, especially if you're using a JSON object, at least in my opinion. All right, and with that, that is all of the official stuff that we have. Let's go ahead and take a look and see if we have any questions. All right, let's see here. All right, so it looks like one of the questions is should you use let if you're only dealing with one field? I'm going to hedge my bets and say it depends. Only because if you're dealing with a lot of nested functions, even though you're only dealing with one field, it might be nice to, instead of have all of those nested functions, just kind of separate them out so that if something goes awry and you need to pull the trick like we did there with the data viewer to kind of see, okay, what is this variable equal to, it makes it easier to kind of step out. I will admit, if I'm in a hurry, sometimes I don't always use let when I'm using a single field and a couple nested functions. But as soon as I get into I'm dealing with 2 or 3 fields, it automatically goes into a let function for me to be able to use. All right, let's see. Here's a good question. How did I add the tab stops? Okay, like I said, as I'm a big fan of white space, so let me go ahead and reshare my desktop here. And what you will see is here in the script editor, and we're just going to go ahead and pick a calculation. As if I've wanted to add another line to this calculation. What you want to do is if you do Option Tab, it will automatically tab you over when you're inside your specified calculation. I believe it's Option Tab if you're on a Mac. I think it's Control Tab for the Windows OS, but I'm not on Windows very often, so I always have to try all the different modifier keys until I get to the right combination. But I believe it's Control Tab, because normally when you're using Tab, it takes you from the specify calculation window to the search box and just kind of moves you around inside the specify calculation window. But if you want the tab here, you want to make sure it's option tab, and then it'll give you your nice, white space as you go ahead and add things in. Yeah, because I really like that. If I did, we'll just have a simple calculation, and I always do this if I'm using like a case, because I like the formatting for it too. That is, and I just did it there. You see I hit the tab instead of the option tab, and then all right. So like I said, big fan of the white space and formatting just to help me read it when I have to come back in and look at it later. All right, so we can just cancel that. We don't need to save that. All right, so that's how you put in those tabs. All right. Okay, it looks like we got another question here, and that is, how do I, or do I always use the let function to define like my script or those $ and the global or the double $ variables? Typically, I do not. If I'm, defining, a local script variable or a global variable, I'm going to use the set variable script step. Just because it's a little bit easier to see. To me, it's a little bit more natural. I know people have differing opinions. Typically, the only time that I will declare a $ or double $ variable within the let statement is if I have done something where I want to do the trick, like I did with the buttons, where I have something I want to declare as part of the let and then use it somewhere else, in my either in that like show custom dialog or even later on in the script, because that your local variables inside the function are only going to be present there until you get the results. So if you need to use a piece of that later on, that's where you're going to want to go ahead and use a like a script variable then at that point. All right, do we have any other questions? Oh, we got one more. And this is a really good question, and that is, can you nest let statements? And the answer is yes. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and go back over here to my desktop, go ahead and pull the script up, and I'm just going to go ahead and create a new script for this. All right, doesn't need to have a name. We'll just do set variable. All right, and what that would look like is, this is just test, is that if we have let I'm not going to make it, the calculation itself is not going to be too difficult. Okay, and just for sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and copy that. So you can certainly do something like this, depending on how complex your calculation needs to be. What you'll see here is, if we just have like if this let statement right here can make use of these two variables that were declared because they're in that outer layer, but once you get into the nested let, you can use variables 1 and 2, but you can't use variables 3 and 4 here in this part of the let statement, because they're internal to that statement that hasn't been declared yet. So you just have to be careful about that, but you certainly can nest your let statements depending on the complexity and stuff like that. Oh, and it doesn't like the table because of that. There we go. Now it's happier. All right. Okay. Let's just hit save all. All right, I think with that, I don't see any more questions coming in. I thank you for sticking around with me today. I think we went a little bit over our usual time, but I appreciate you being here. So thank you very much.